The morning sun rose over New Horizon Colony like it had done for 5 years now, and nobody thought this day would be different from any other day. Children ran through the streets on their way to school while their parents prepared for another day of work, building humanity's first real home among the stars. The colony sat on a beautiful planet that humans had named Kepler 442b, and it was perfect for human life with blue skies and green forests and water that tasted clean and pure. 52,000 people lived here now, and they were proud of what they had built. Admiral Jacob. Manning was on Earth when the news came, and he was sitting in his office reviewing supply reports when his assistant burst through the door with a face white as snow. The assistant could barely speak, but he managed to say that something terrible had happened at New Horizon and that the communications had gone silent 3 hours ago. Manning felt his stomach drop because his daughter Elizabeth lived on New Horizon with her husband and their 2 young children, and he had talked to her just yesterday. She had been excited about her son's birthday party next week and had asked Manning to send some Earth chocolate as a gift. Now the communications were silent. The emergency meeting began within minutes, and every important person in Earth's government crowded into the war room to watch the screen. The footage came from an automated satellite that orbited Kepler 442b, and what it showed made grown men cry and hardened soldiers turn away in disgust. Alien ships hung in orbit above New Horizon, and they were firing down at the colony with weapons that turned buildings into dust and people into ash. The attack had been going on for 6 hours already, and there was nothing left of the colony, except burning ruins and smoke rising into that perfect blue sky. The aliens were methodical and thorough, and they made sure nothing survived. Manning watched every second of that footage, and his face showed nothing but his hands, gripped the table so hard that his knuckles turned white. He watched the alien soldiers land on the surface and walk through the ruins, shooting anyone who had somehow survived the bombardment. He watched them laugh and celebrate like they had won some glorious victory against unarmed civilians and children. He watched them broadcast their triumph across space like they were proud of what they had done. When the footage ended, the room sat in absolute silence until Manning stood up slowly and said in a voice cold as ice that humanity would respond to this attack. The aliens called themselves the Vraxis Empire, and they were part of something called the Galactic Coalition that ruled most of known space. The coalition had existed for 40,000 years and included thousands of different alien species, and they had rules about territory and borders that humans didn't fully understand yet. The Vraxis claimed that Kepler 442b was in their territory, even though it had been empty when humans arrived 5 years ago. They had sent a message demanding that humans abandon the colony, but the message had been arrogant and dismissive, and the human government had sent back a polite refusal. The humans had said that the planet was unclaimed, and that international law supported their right to settle there. The Vraxis response was to send their fleet and murder every human on the planet. The Vraxis leader was called High Counselor Zektar, and he gave a speech after the attack explaining that it had been necessary to teach humanity their place in the galactic order. He said that young species needed to learn respect for their elders, and that the coalition would not tolerate human arrogance. He said the attack was merciful compared to what they could have done, and that humanity should be grateful the Vraxis had only destroyed one colony. His speech was broadcast across coalition space, and other alien species watched with approval or indifference. This was how things worked in the galaxy, and everyone accepted it as normal. Everyone except the humans. Manning buried himself in work after that first day because if he stopped working, he would have to think about Elizabeth and her family and what their last moments must have been like. He gathered his best officers and started planning, and the plans they made were not about defense or negotiation. Captain Lisa Warren came from the lunar base where she commanded a small patrol fleet, and when Manning explained what he wanted her to do, she simply nodded and asked when they would begin. Dr. Henry Cole arrived from the research station, and Manning asked him if he could create weapons that would kill Vraxis efficiently, and Cole said yes without hesitation. Lieutenant Commander. Sophie Blake had been off-world when New Horizon died, and she had lost friends there, and she volunteered to lead any mission Manning needed, no matter how dangerous. The United Earth government held a vote 3 days after the massacre, and the question was simple. Should humanity declare war on the Vraxis Empire and anyone who supported them? Some politicians argued for caution, and said that humanity was too weak to fight the coalition and that they should negotiate. These voices were shouted down by others who said that the Vraxis had already declared war by attacking New Horizon, and that humanity had no choice but to respond. The vote was taken and it was unanimous. Every nation on Earth agreed, and every colony agreed, and every human in space agreed. They would go to war, and they would not stop until the Vraxis paid for what they had done. Manning sent a message to the Vraxis Empire and to the Galactic Coalition, and the message was broadcast across every frequency humans could access. The message said that the Vraxis Empire had committed an act of genocide against humanity, and that humanity demanded justice. Manning listed every single demand: the immediate surrender of High Counselor Zektar and every officer involved in the attack, full reparations for the destruction of New Horizon, and a formal apology from the Galactic Coalition. If these demands were not met within 30 days, then humanity would consider itself at war with the Vraxis Empire and any species that supported them. The message ended with one final line that would become famous across the galaxy. Humanity did not start this war, but they would end every single species that participated in it. The Vraxis response came within hours, and it was laughter. High Counselor Zektar gave another speech where he mocked humanity's threats and said that one primitive species could not challenge the might of the Vraxis Empire. He said that if humans wanted war, then the Vraxis would happily provide it, and that Earth itself would burn just like New Horizon had burned. Other coalition species watched this exchange with amusement, because everyone knew that humanity was weak and young and couldn't possibly win against an empire that had conquered hundreds of worlds. They thought this would be over quickly, and that humanity would learn their lesson and submit to coalition authority. Earth transformed in those 30 days while waiting for the deadline to pass. Every factory that made civilian goods switched to military production and started churning out weapons and ships and ammunition. Every scientist who had been researching peaceful technology began working on ways to kill Vraxis more efficiently. Every person who could fight volunteered for military service, and the training camps overflowed with recruits. Commander Ryan Mitchell took over the shipyards and began designing new warships using every scrap of alien technology that humans had managed to acquire through trade. The ships he designed were ugly and brutal, but they were effective, and that was all that mattered. Now Dr. Cole worked day and night in his laboratory, studying Vraxis biology from samples that human traders had collected over the years. He found weaknesses in their immune systems and their genetic structure, and he began creating diseases that would target those weaknesses specifically. The work made him sick to his stomach because he was designing weapons that would cause horrible suffering, but he kept working because he remembered the footage of Vraxis soldiers laughing as they shot human survivors. Captain Warren took command of the newly built ship called the UES Vengeance, and she drilled her crew until they could operate the weapons systems in their sleep. Lieutenant Commander Blake assembled a team of special forces soldiers and began training them for missions behind enemy lines. The 30 days passed, and the Vraxis had not responded to any of humanity's demands, and so the war began exactly as Manning had promised it would. The human fleet left Earth orbit and headed toward Vraxis space, and they moved slowly because their ships were not as fast as Vraxis vessels. It took 6 weeks to reach the border of Vraxis territory, and during that time the Vraxis military prepared to meet them with confidence and contempt. Fleet Commander Thrall was given the assignment to drive away the human fleet, and he accepted it eagerly because he thought it would be an easy victory that would advance his career. He had led the attack on New Horizon, and he had personally given the order to bombard the colony, and he expected the humans to break and run as soon as they saw his ships. The two fleets met at the edge of an asteroid field, and Thrall positioned his ships in a standard defensive formation because that was what Vraxis military doctrine taught. He had 70 ships against humanity's 40, and his vessels had better weapons and better shields and thousands of years of combat experience. The humans approached in what looked like a disorganized cluster, and Thrall smiled because he thought they were amateurs who didn't understand proper fleet tactics. He ordered his ships to advance and prepare to fire, and he expected the battle to be over within a. The victory at the asteroid field changed everything, and suddenly the Galactic Coalition was paying attention to humanity in ways they never had before. High Counselor Zektar tried to dismiss the battle as a lucky accident and said that humans had simply caught Fleet Commander Thrall by surprise. He sent more ships and better commanders and promised the coalition that humanity would be crushed within months. Admiral Manning watched these pronouncements from Earth, and he smiled coldly because he knew something the Vraxis didn't understand yet. Humans had spent their entire history fighting each other, and they had learned lessons about warfare that the peaceful coalition had forgotten thousands of years. Captain Warren took the human fleet deeper into Vraxis space, and she began attacking targets that had nothing to do with military strength. She hit mining stations that provided raw materials for Vraxis industry, and she destroyed trade convoys carrying food and medicine to Vraxis colonies. She attacked fuel depots and communications relays and shipyards where new vessels were being built. Every target was chosen carefully to cause maximum economic damage, and the Vraxis military found itself unable to protect everything at once. Warren moved fast and hit hard and disappeared before reinforcements could arrive, and the Vraxis began to panic because their supply lines were collapsing. Commander Ryan Mitchell kept improving human ships with every battle, and he studied the wreckage of destroyed Vraxis vessels to understand their technology better. He found that Vraxis shields were strong against energy weapons, but weaker against physical projectiles, and so he designed new missiles that could punch through their defenses. He discovered that Vraxis sensors operated on specific frequencies, and he built jamming systems that made human ships nearly invisible until they were too close to avoid. Every innovation was shared across the entire fleet within days, and the humans adapted faster than the Vraxis could respond. Lieutenant Commander Sophie Blake led her team on their first mission. Behind enemy lines 3 months into the war, and the target was a Vraxis colony world called Theron Prime. The colony had 2 million inhabitants and served as a major supply hub for the Vraxis military in this sector. Blake and her team infiltrated the planet using forged identification, and they spent 2 weeks gathering intelligence and preparing. Dr. Cole had given them containers of a biological agent that he had designed specifically for Vraxis biology, and the agent was invisible and odorless and incredibly contagious. Blake released it into the water supply and the ventilation systems of the colony's largest cities, and then her team evacuated before anyone noticed. The disease took 3 days to show symptoms, and by then it had spread to over half the population, and there was no way to stop it. The Vraxis medical system tried to contain the outbreak, but they had never seen anything like this before, and their treatments were useless. The disease attacked the respiratory system and caused slow suffocation over a period of weeks, and it was designed to be painful and terrifying. 30 million Vraxis civilians died on Theron Prime, and 2 other colonies where Blake's team had released the same agent. The galaxy watched in horror as images of the dying spread across news networks, and many species began demanding that humans stop using such terrible weapons. Admiral Manning held a press conference to address the galactic outcry, and his face showed no emotion as he spoke. He said that humanity had not wanted this war and had tried to resolve the situation peacefully, but the Vraxis had chosen genocide instead. He said that biological weapons were terrible things, but the Vraxis had used weapons just as terrible when they burned New Horizon and murdered 52,000 civilians, including children. He said that if the galaxy wanted humanity to stop, then the galaxy should convince the Vraxis to surrender and face justice for their crimes. Until that happened, humanity would use every weapon at their disposal, no matter how horrific, because the Vraxis had proven they understood nothing except overwhelming force. Ambassador Kira represented a species called the Lumens, and they were one of the few coalition races that had opposed the attack on New Horizon from the beginning. She requested a meeting with Manning on neutral ground, and he agreed because he respected that the Lumens had tried to stop the massacre. They met on a small space station, and Kira pleaded with Manning to show restraint and mercy. She said that many innocent Vraxis civilians were dying, who had nothing to do with the attack on New Horizon, and that humanity was becoming the very monster they claimed to be fighting against. Manning listened quietly, and when she finished, he asked her a simple question. Where was the coalition's mercy when human children were burning? Kira had no answer because she knew Manning was right, and the coalition had shown no mercy and had even celebrated the attack as justified. Manning told her that humanity would accept only one condition for peace. Every Vraxis officer and official involved in ordering or executing the New Horizon massacre must be handed over for trial and execution. The Galactic Coalition must formally apologize and pay reparations, and the Vraxis Empire must be permanently disbanded. Kira said those terms were impossible, and that the coalition would never agree. Manning stood to leave and said then the war would continue until the Vraxis Empire no longer existed, and every species that supported them would learn what happened when you made humanity your enemy. The Vraxis tried to strike back against human colonies, but they found that humanity had prepared for this possibility. Every human world was defended by weapons platforms and minefields and automated defense systems that could operate without human crews. When a Vraxis fleet attacked the human colony at Proxima Centauri, they lost 40 ships before they even got close to the planet, and the survivors retreated after accomplishing nothing. The humans had learned from New Horizon, and they would never again leave their people defenseless against alien attack. Every colony was a fortress, and every civilian knew how to fight and where to take shelter. High Counselor Zektar made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his short life, and he ordered the Vraxis military to execute human prisoners on public broadcasts. He thought this would break human morale and make them afraid, but he understood nothing about human psychology. The broadcasts showed Vraxis soldiers torturing and killing captured human spacers, and the footage was meant to terrify Earth into surrender. Instead, it had the opposite effect, and every human who saw those broadcasts felt their resolve harden into something cold and implacable. Manning received thousands of messages from civilians volunteering for military service, and the recruitment centers were overwhelmed with people demanding to be sent to fight. Dr. Cole accelerated his work after seeing the execution broadcasts, and he created more biological weapons tailored to different coalition species. He identified 43 species that had publicly supported the Vraxis attack on New Horizon, or had provided military assistance to the Vraxis war effort. For each species, he designed a specific disease that would target their unique biology and cause maximum casualties. The work destroyed him mentally, and he stopped sleeping and lost weight, and his colleagues worried about his health. But he kept working because every time he closed his eyes he saw those execution broadcasts, and he knew that mercy was wasted on species who celebrated human suffering. Lieutenant Commander Blake trained more infiltration teams and sent them across coalition space to prepare for what Manning called Operation Reckoning. Each team carried samples of the biological weapons Cole had created, and they infiltrated target worlds quietly and carefully. The teams spent months establishing themselves in alien societies and learning the infrastructure, and waiting for the signal to act. Blake herself led the team targeting the Vraxis homeworld, and she studied Vraxis culture and learned their language and walked among them disguised as a trader from a client species. Nobody suspected that the quiet merchant selling human goods was actually planning their extinction. The Galactic Coalition began to fracture under the pressure of the war, and smaller species started questioning whether defending Vraxis interests was worth the cost. Several minor species approached human diplomats secretly and offered to stay neutral in exchange for human promises not to attack them. Manning agreed to these deals because he had no quarrel with species that hadn't participated in the New Horizon massacre. He made it clear that humanity was not interested in conquest or empire building, and that any species that stayed out of the war would be left alone, but any species that helped the Vraxis would share their fate. A scholar named Mexrin published a paper analyzing human military tactics and psychology, and his conclusions terrified anyone who read them. He explained that humans were apex predators who had evolved through constant warfare and competition, and that their capacity for organized violence exceeded anything the Coalition had encountered before. He warned that the Coalition's mistake was treating humans like prey when they were actually the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. His paper was dismissed by many as alarmist, but those who believed him began distancing themselves from the Vraxis and preparing for a future where humanity dominated galactic politics. Captain Warren destroyed her 17th major shipyard 8 months into the war, and she felt nothing but cold satisfaction as she watched the Vraxis Empire made its last stand at their homeworld, and every remaining ship was called back to defend the heart of their civilization. High Counselor Zektar stood on the command deck of his flagship and watched the defensive fleet assemble around the planet, and he believed they could still win if they fought together. He had 500 ships gathered here, and millions of soldiers ready to defend their home, and surely that would be enough to stop the humans. The Vraxis population watched from the surface, and they were afraid, but they believed their military would protect them because That was what militaries were supposed to do. The human fleet arrived at the edge of the system, and Admiral Manning commanded from the bridge of the new flagship called the UES Justice. He had brought 200 ships, and they were all that remained of Earth's hastily built navy after 18 months of constant warfare. Manning looked at the tactical display showing the Vraxis defensive positions, and he made a decision that would define the end of the war. He ordered the fleet to establish a blockade around the Vraxis homeworld, and not to engage the defensive fleet unless attacked first. The Vraxis were confused because they expected humans to attack immediately, and instead the human ships just sat there waiting. Manning sent a message to High Counselor Zektar offering terms of surrender for the final time. The terms were simple and unchanged from the beginning. Zektar and every officer involved in the New Horizon massacre must surrender for trial and execution. The Vraxis Empire must disband permanently. Full reparations must be paid to humanity, and the Galactic Coalition must formally apologize. If these terms were accepted within 7 days, then humanity would allow the Vraxis population to live under human occupation. If the terms were rejected, then the blockade would continue until the Vraxis homeworld ran out of food and medicine, and the population starved. Zektar rejected the terms immediately and called them barbaric, and said the Vraxis would never surrender to primitive humans. The blockade continued and nothing entered or left the Vraxis homeworld, and within weeks the effects began to show. The planet imported most of its food from agricultural colonies, and those supply lines were now cut and the stored reserves started running low. The government implemented strict rationing, but that only slowed the inevitable, and people began going hungry. Medical supplies ran short, and hospitals struggled to treat the sick and wounded from the biological weapons that had swept through months earlier. Power generation decreased as fuel for the reactors was consumed without replacement, and some cities experienced rolling blackouts. The Vraxis military sat in orbit with their 500 ships and watched helplessly as their civilization began to collapse. Captain Warren commanded a wing of the blockade fleet, and she enforced the cordon with ruthless efficiency. Any ship that tried to break through was destroyed immediately without warning, and several Vraxis cargo vessels learned this lesson the hard way. Warren felt no sympathy for the Vraxis civilians suffering below because she remembered New Horizon and she remembered the execution broadcasts, and she believed every Vraxis death was justified payment for what they had done. Her crew agreed with her, and they performed their duties with cold professionalism, and nobody questioned whether what they were doing was right. 3 months into the blockade, civil unrest erupted on the Vraxis homeworld as hungry, desperate people rioted in the streets demanding that their government surrender. High Counselor Zektar ordered the military to suppress the riots, and soldiers fired on civilians in the capital city, and hundreds died. This only made things worse, and more people joined the protests, and the government lost control of several major cities. A group of junior officers attempted a military coup to remove Zektar and negotiate peace with humanity. But the coup failed, and Zektar had the conspirators executed publicly. The message was clear. The Vraxis would fight to the last rather than accept human terms. Lieutenant Commander Sophie Blake received intelligence that Zektar was planning to evacuate from the homeworld with his senior staff and escape to a hidden base in another system. Manning authorized an immediate assault on the Vraxis defensive fleet because he would not allow Zektar to escape justice. Captain Warren led the attack, and the human fleet engaged the Vraxis ships in the largest space battle of the war. The Vraxis fought desperately because they were defending their home, but they were exhausted and demoralized, and their tactics were predictable. The battle lasted 9 hours, and when it ended, 400 Vraxis ships were destroyed, while humanity lost 70 vessels. Human Marines stormed Zektar's flagship and found him trying to reach an escape pod, and they captured him alive, along with 50 senior officers who had commanded the attack on New Horizon. Manning ordered the prisoners brought to Earth for trial, and the Vraxis homeworld surrendered immediately after Zektar's capture. The remaining Vraxis military forces laid down their weapons, and the government collapsed, and humanity took control of the planet. The occupation began with human soldiers enforcing martial law and distributing food and medicine to the starving population. The Vraxis people were too exhausted and broken to resist, and they accepted occupation as better than continued suffering. The war crimes trials began 2 weeks later, and they were held on Earth in a massive courtroom built specifically for this purpose. High Counselor Zektar stood accused of genocide and crimes against humanity, and 3,000 other Vraxis officers faced similar charges. The trials were broadcast across the entire galaxy, and every species watched as humanity presented evidence of what had happened at New Horizon. The footage of the massacre was shown in complete detail, and the courtroom fell silent as people watched human children dying. Zektar's defense was that he had been following standard coalition policy for dealing with territorial disputes and that the attack had been legally justified under galactic law. Admiral Manning testified at the trial, and he spoke for 17 hours reading the name and age of every single person who died at New Horizon. He described each victim's life and their dreams and what they had been doing when the Vraxis attacked. He talked about his daughter Elizabeth and her husband and their 2 children who were 5 and 7 years old. He described how Elizabeth had loved teaching at the colony school and how she had talked about wanting to see Earth again someday. When Manning finished his testimony, the courtroom was filled with people crying, and even some of the Vraxis defendants looked shaken by the recitation of names and lives. The verdict was guilty for Zektar and for all 3,000 officers who had participated in planning or executing the New Horizon attack. The sentence was death by execution, and it would be carried out immediately. Zektar protested that the trial had been a mockery of justice, and that humans were no better than the monsters they claimed to be punishing. Manning responded during the sentencing that the trial had been far more fair than what Zektar had given the children of New Horizon, who died without trial or mercy. The executions were carried out the next day and broadcast across Coalition space with a message attached. This is what happens when you murder human children. 17. Vraxis worlds remained under human occupation, and Commander Ryan Mitchell helped establish the occupation governments, with strict rules designed to prevent any future Vraxis aggression. All Vraxis military forces were permanently disbanded, and weapons manufacturing was forbidden, and human forces maintained bases on every occupied world. The Vraxis population was required to attend education programs, teaching them about New Horizon, and about human history, and about why the war had happened. Some Vraxis accepted this and others resented it, but nobody dared resist openly because they had seen what happened to those who fought against humanity. Dr. Henry Cole stopped working after the trials ended, and he destroyed all his research, notes on biological weapons, because he never wanted anyone to create such things again. He gave interviews where he talked about the guilt he felt over the billions who had died from his creations, and he said that, even though the weapons had been necessary, they had taken a piece of his soul that he would never get back. Some people called him a war criminal and others called him a hero, but Cole rejected both labels and said he was just a scientist who had done terrible things for what he believed was a good reason. He spent the rest of his life working on medical research, trying to save lives instead of ending them. Lieutenant Commander Blake led humanitarian efforts on the occupied Vraxis worlds, ensuring that civilians received food and medical care, and that the occupation was as fair as possible given the circumstances. Some of her subordinates questioned why they were helping the species that had murdered human children, and Blake's response was simple. Humanity was not fighting to become monsters, but to ensure monsters faced justice. The Vraxis civilians had not ordered the attack on New Horizon, and while their silence had been complicity, they did not deserve to starve or suffer unnecessarily. Blake's approach earned respect from some Vraxis who began to see that humans could be both ruthless warriors and compassionate peacekeepers. The Galactic Coalition formally dissolved 6 months after Zektar's execution, and 40,000 years of galactic governance ended with a whimper rather than a bang. The coalition had been held together by the military MA. 5 years passed after the war ended, and humanity controlled a sphere of influence that encompassed 50 star systems, and nobody entered the space without explicit permission from Earth. The borders were marked with automated defense, platforms that would destroy any unauthorized vessel within seconds, and everyone in the galaxy knew not to test these defenses. Human colonies flourished in their isolation, and the population grew to over 2 billion people spread across multiple worlds. Every colony was built like a fortress with weapon systems and shelters and evacuation plans, because humanity would never again be caught unprepared like they had been at New Horizon. Trade between humans and alien species existed, but it was minimal and heavily regulated, and humans preferred to be self-sufficient rather than dependent on others. Human merchants who dealt with aliens were watched carefully by intelligence services, and any alien vessel entering human space was inspected thoroughly before being allowed to proceed. The memory of New Horizon ensured that no human wanted to rely on aliens for anything important, and this isolation became a defining characteristic of human civilization. Children grew up learning that the galaxy was dangerous, and that only other humans could be truly trusted. Admiral Jacob Manning retired at age 67, and he gave his final interview on the anniversary of the New Horizon massacre. The reporter asked if he had any regrets about the war, and Manning sat quietly for a long moment before answering. He said that he regretted every death on both sides, but that he would make the same decisions again if faced with the same circumstances. He said the galaxy had taught humanity that mercy was weakness, and that peaceful species got destroyed by aggressive ones. Humanity had learned that lesson and would never forget it, and any species that threatened human lives in the future would face the same overwhelming response. His message to the galaxy was simple. Humans wanted peace, but they were always ready for war. The generation that grew up after the war was different from their parents, and they were raised in a culture defined by military preparedness and suspicion of aliens. Every child learned tactical training in school along with mathematics and literature, and every teenager spent time in youth military programs learning to fight. The phrase "never again" was carved into monuments on every human world, and children visited these memorials on field trips to learn about what happened when humanity let its guard down. Some people worried that this culture was too militaristic and that humanity was becoming defined by violence, but most people believed it was necessary to prevent another New Horizon. Scholar Mexerin established the Institute for Human Studies on a neutral world far from human space, and its purpose was to help other species understand humanity and avoid future conflicts. The Institute gathered every scrap of information about human history and psychology and warfare, and they published papers analyzing what made humans so dangerous when threatened. One key finding was that humans had a concept of family and tribe that extended beyond immediate relatives to include anyone they considered part of their group. Attacking one human was attacking all humans, and this collective identity made them impossible to intimidate or divide. The Institute became the most prestigious academic institution in former coalition space. Ambassador Kira visited Earth for the first time since the war ended, and she was shocked by what she found. She had expected to see a dark militaristic society ruled by fear, but instead she saw peaceful cities full of happy families and beautiful parks and thriving culture. The humans she met were friendly and curious and showed her kindness that surprised her. But she also noticed the military bases on every world and the weapons training that children received, and the monuments to the dead. She realized that humanity had not become evil or cruel, but they had simply accepted that they lived in a dangerous galaxy and prepared accordingly. The cognitive dissonance troubled her deeply. A rogue Vraxis faction that rejected the peace launched a terrorist attack on a human mining station, killing 42 workers, and they broadcast a message saying they would never forget and never surrender. The galaxy held its breath because everyone remembered what happened the last time humans were attacked, and panic spread through Vraxis communities across space. Many Vraxis fled their homes expecting human retaliation, and some species offered to help hunt down the terrorists, hoping to prevent another war. The new human government led by President Helen Carter faced its first major crisis, and hardliners demanded total Vraxis extermination, while moderates argued for restraint. President Carter gave a carefully worded speech that was broadcast across the galaxy, and she said that humanity would hunt down every individual involved in the terrorist attack and execute them, but that the broader Vraxis population would not be punished. She said that humanity had learned the difference between justice and vengeance, and that punishing innocent people for the crimes of terrorists would make humans no better than those they had fought against. However, she also made clear that anyone who helped the terrorists or sheltered them would be considered enemy combatants and treated accordingly. The speech reassured many species, but some humans felt it was too soft. Lieutenant Commander Sophie Blake was now Director of Human Intelligence, and she led the manhunt for the terrorists with the same methodical efficiency she had shown during the war. Her agents tracked the terrorists across 3 star systems and identified every member of the cell and everyone who had helped them. The operation took 3 months, and it was surgical and precise and demonstrated that humanity had lost none of its lethality. Every terrorist was captured or killed, and several Vraxes who had sheltered them were arrested and tried for aiding terrorism. The trials were fair, and those found guilty received long prison sentences rather than execution. The measured response to the terrorist attack surprised many species who had assumed humanity would use it as an excuse for another extermination campaign. Scholar Mexerin published an updated paper explaining that humans were capable of both extreme violence and extreme precision, depending on the circumstances. He argued that the key to peaceful relations with humanity was understanding that they responded proportionally to threats, but their definition of proportional was different from other species. Attacking military targets might bring a military response, but attacking civilians or children would bring total war. The paper became required reading for every diplomat in the galaxy. Admiral Manning passed away peacefully at age 73, surrounded by family, and his funeral was attended by thousands of humans who saw him as the savior of their species. President Carter gave the eulogy, and she spoke about how Manning had carried the burden of terrible decisions so that humanity could survive, and how history would remember him as both a hero and a warning. Surprisingly, Ambassador Kira attended the funeral, and she laid a wreath at his grave with a note that read, "You terrified us, but you were never dishonest. Rest well, Admiral." Her gesture was seen as a sign that perhaps humans and aliens could eventually move beyond the trauma of the war. The new Galactic Council held its first major session 5 years after its founding, and representatives from over 500 species attended to discuss trade, agreements, and border disputes in scientific cooperation. Humanity sent a delegation, but they sat quietly in the back and only spoke when military matters were discussed. President Carter made clear that humanity had no interest in governing other species or telling them how to run their societies, but that humans would veto any proposal that involved military aggression. The other species accepted this arrangement because they understood that human veto power was the price of having humanity as a peaceful neighbor rather than a terrifying enemy. Commander Ryan Mitchell continued designing defensive systems for species that requested human help, and his reputation meant that any world protected by his technology was considered untouchable. He had become wealthy from his work, but he gave most of his money to programs supporting war veterans and families of soldiers who had died in the conflict. Mitchell believed that humanity's creativity and adaptability were their greatest advantages, and he taught these principles to a new generation of engineers. His philosophy was simple: prepare for the worst and hope for the best, and never assume your enemy will fight the way you expect them. Dr. Cole lived quietly on a research station studying alien diseases and developing cures, and he rarely spoke about his role in the war. When journalists asked him about the biological weapons he had created, he would say only that he had done what was necessary, and that he hoped humanity would never need such weapons again. He maintained contact with the families of New Horizon victims and attended memorial services every year because he felt he owed them that much. In his private journals, he wrote about the guilt he carried and about his hope that future generations would find better ways to resolve conflicts than the methods he had been forced to use. Lieutenant Commander Blake continued her work in intelligence, but she also established training programs teaching cultural sensitivity and diplomatic skills to human operatives. She believed that humanity needed to be good at both war and peace, and that being prepared for violence didn't mean seeking it out. Her programs emphasized understanding alien psychology and finding non-vio. 25 years after the war ended, humanity had transformed from galactic newcomers into the unquestioned dominant power, and nobody challenged their authority or questioned their decisions. Human colonies numbered over 200 worlds, and humanity commanded the largest and most advanced fleet in known space. Human technology had surpassed anything the old coalition had possessed, because humans approached innovation differently from other species. Where aliens refined existing designs for centuries, humans constantly experimented and adapted and improved. The galaxy had learned that underestimating human capabilities was a fatal mistake. The new Galactic Council functioned well under the system that had been established, and humanity served as a founding member with permanent veto power over military matters. Most species found this arrangement acceptable because the alternative was worse, and nobody wanted to risk provoking humanity into another war. The Council mediated disputes peacefully and established trade regulations and coordinated scientific research across species boundaries. Humanity participated in most discussions but took a hands-off approach to governing other species. President Lucas Grant explained this policy clearly. Humans would stop wars but would not tell anyone how to live. Captain Nathan Cross commanded the newest human warship called the UES Remembrance, and at 32 years old he represented a generation that knew the war only. Through history classes and stories from veterans, Cross had never fought in combat, and most of his career involved patrol missions and diplomatic escorts and occasional pirate suppression. His generation struggled with the legacy they inherited because they were trained for war but lived in peace. They worked alongside aliens daily but were taught never to fully trust them. The contradiction created tension in human society and debates about whether humanity should maintain its isolation or integrate more fully. With galactic civilization, a movement emerged among young humans advocating for closer relationships with alien species, and they argued that humanity could not remain isolated forever. They pointed out that most current alien governments had not participated in the New Horizon massacre, and that holding grudges against species who had not wronged humanity was counterproductive. These voices grew louder, especially on colonies far from Earth, where humans interacted with aliens regularly. The older generation, particularly war veterans, resisted this shift, and they argued that vigilance was the only thing keeping humanity safe. The debate became heated, with both sides claiming to honor the memory of New Horizon while proposing opposite approaches. Lieutenant Eva Martinez served as Director of Cultural Relations, and she was the daughter of Sophie Blake, and she had grown up hearing stories about the war from her mother. Martinez argued for what she called the middle path. Remember the past and prepare for the worst, but do not let fear prevent building a better future. She believed humanity could maintain strong defenses while also developing genuine friendships with peaceful species. Her position gained traction among moderate voices who were tired of the constant tension but unwilling to abandon the lessons learned at such terrible cost. Martinez often quoted her mother's words. True strength means having the power to destroy but choosing not to use it. Humanity made first contact with a species called the Azurion Collective, and they were a young civilization from beyond former Coalition space who knew nothing of human history. The Azurians were peaceful and curious, and they approached humanity with open friendliness that took human diplomats by surprise. President Grant faced a decision about how to respond, and this decision would define humanity's future relationship with new species. Some advisors argued for maintaining distance and showing overwhelming force, while others suggested treating the Azurians with the same openness they showed humanity. Grant chose a balanced approach. Send diplomats backed by military escorts but keep the military at a distance, and extend friendship while making clear that aggression would meet overwhelming response. Captain Cross led the human delegation to meet the Azurians, and the first encounter went well, with both sides exchanging information about their cultures and histories. The Azurians were fascinated by humanity and asked many questions about Earth and human expansion into space. Cross answered honestly and explained that humanity had faced tragedy early in their galactic journey, but had survived and grown stronger. The Azurians asked to learn more about this tragedy, and Cross provided them with historical records about New Horizon. The Azurian reaction was shock and horror, followed by immediate apologies, even though their species had nothing to do with the attack. Cross assured the Azurians that they were not responsible for the past and that humanity judged species based on their own actions rather than the crimes of others. His speech became famous when he said that humans had learned hard lessons, but did not want to teach those lessons to everyone they met. The Azurians appreciated this sentiment, and formal diplomatic relations began between humanity and the Azurian Collective. This became a template for how humanity approached other new species. Be honest about the past, be prepared for the worst, but give others a chance to prove themselves peaceful. The approach seemed to work, and several new species joined the galactic community under human protection. The 50th anniversary of the New Horizon massacre arrived, and humanity built a massive memorial in the Kepler 442b system on the exact location where the colony had stood. The memorial was a work of art and engineering that listed all 52,000 names of the dead, and at its center stood a sculpture of a human child reaching toward the stars. The inscription read, "They reached for the stars, and the stars reached back with fire. We will never forget, we will never forgive, but we will never stop reaching." The memorial took 3 years to construct, and it was designed to last for thousands of years as a reminder to future generations about the cost of being unprepared. Delegations from across the galaxy attended the memorial ceremony, and many species sent formal apologies for their government's roles in the war or their silence during the massacre. The human government accepted these apologies with grace, but President Grant made clear in his speech that forgiveness was not the same as forgetting. He said that humanity had moved beyond hatred and wanted peaceful cooperation with all species, but that the memory of New Horizon would forever influence human policy. Any species that threatened human civilians would face the same response that the Vraxes had faced, and no amount of time or distance would change that fundamental truth. Ambassador Kira attended the ceremony, and she was now elderly and frail, but she insisted on giving a speech on behalf of the species that had opposed the attack. She acknowledged that her people's silence had been complicity, and that watching humanity's retaliation had taught her species the cost of choosing convenience over conscience. She said that the Lumens would forever carry shame for not doing more to prevent the massacre, and that they hoped younger species would learn from their failure. Her speech moved many in the audience to tears, and it represented a kind of closure that had been missing for decades. Kira died peacefully 2 years later, having dedicated her final years to promoting peace and understanding. Scholar Mexrin published his final work before his death, and it was a comprehensive analysis of how the New Horizon massacre had reshaped galactic civilization. He argued that the war had destroyed an old order based on the dominance of ancient species, and replaced it with a new order based on mutual respect enforced by human military might. He wrote that humanity had asked the galaxy what they were, and the galaxy had answered by attacking their children, and humanity had responded with such overwhelming force that the entire political structure collapsed. His conclusion was that humanity was what you made them. Make them friends and they were loyal allies. Make them enemies and they were thorough exterminators. The choice had always been with other species. The new Galactic Council debated a proposal to officially apologize for the New Horizon massacre and recognize it as the defining tragedy that reshaped galactic civilization. The measure passed unanimously because no species dared oppose it, and many genuinely believed the apology was deserved. The formal apology was presented to President Grant at a special ceremony, and he accepted it with grace and dignity. He reminded the Council that humanity sought partnership rather than dominance, and that the galaxy could choose its own path forward. But he also reminded them of Admiral Manning's words from decades earlier. Humanity did not start the war, but they ended it, and they would end any future war the same way. Lieutenant Martinez worked with the Institute for Human Studies to develop educational programs teaching both humans and aliens about interspecies relations and conflict prevention. The programs emphasized communication and cultural understanding, and the importance of keeping agreements. Martinez believed that most conflicts arose from misunderstanding rather than malice, and that education could prevent future tragedies. Her programs became widely adopted across the galaxy, and a new generation grew up learning about New Horizon as a cautionary tale about the consequences of casual violence. The hope was that by understanding what had happened and why, future species would avoid making the same mistakes. Commander Mitchell retired from active work at age 72,